Hello there, it's Silver. This is Into the Necrovale. So this is an action RPG that's using some roguelite-y elements, but I wouldn't actually call it one of those specifically, mostly because it doesn't use any kind of permadeath or anything like that. You don't lose progression or gear or anything when you die, and you can pretty easily just restart the level you were on and continue from there. This is also a game that's in early access, but feels pretty complete as it currently is. I actually first thought that it was complete. I didn't actually realize that it was in early access at first. That's just because there's already an entire game here, basically, including some post-game or end-game stuff, so there's a lot here to go through. The basic gameplay loop is pretty simple. You have a long list of dungeons that you can actually crawl in pretty much any order you want, although you do have to unlock them using these things called hope crystals, more on that later. But once you choose a specific dungeon path, it will have a whole bunch of different levels to it, like 8 levels as well as 2 boss levels, one halfway through and one at the very end. And you have to beat the halfway through boss in order to unlock the end boss. But aside from that, you can basically play them in any order you want if you wish, including skipping some of them if you feel that you can do so. But of course you are going to want to play them to get some gear and upgrades and stuff. That way, by the time you make it to the final boss of each area, you can actually kill it. Each step of the area consists of a whole bunch of different rooms that you'll go through as one run. And as you go through the game and get to the later dungeon areas, the number of rooms gets longer. But each dungeon area also has its own set of chambers that you can come across. They're all different from each other, not only in terms of the enemies, all of the enemies are completely different for each area, as well as, of course, the tile set itself, what it all looks like. But each one also has its own named rooms, and they all have their own unique hazards that you've got to deal with, including some that are non-combat rooms and involve some other stuff that's usually beneficial to you if you know how to deal with it, but oftentimes each dungeon has its own sort of mechanics that you've got to deal with. Like one of them, for instance, has you collecting bait, and you can spend this bait on various things like going fishing for items or feeding it to an NPC for unique loot. And then another one has enemies that actually drop curses. And despite their name, the curses are not entirely negative. They're actually a good and a bad thing at the same time. And you can then choose to burn some of these curses on other positive effects if you wish, or keep them for the rest of the run. As you complete rooms, you'll also be gaining a resource called Hope. And hope is in that little blue bar at the bottom of the screen that's sort of two-sided, because the other side is despair, which is negative hope. And this is important because it's your main method of progression. At the end of every run, you'll enter the Temple of Hope, where you get to pray before a statue. When you do this, it refills your health back to full and also resets your hope to 0. If it was negative, it doesn't do anything good for you except for reset it, but if it was positive, you also get hope crystals, which are the main currency for doing most of anything in this game. The number of crystals you get is partially determined by how far through the game you are, and also by how much hope you had at the time you made it to the statue. In between runs, you'll also go to a hub area, and this is where you'll spend those crystals most of the time. You can also spend them in run sometimes, depending on where you are, but the main times you're actually using them are in this hub area on various NPCs, because there are lots of NPCs in it that do different things for you. There's a merchant, for instance, that can sell you all sorts of goods, and every time you give him more and more hope crystals, then he'll get a better stock in, up until he can actually eventually start stocking like legendary items very rarely. And there's also an alchemist that'll sell you potions, and if you keep giving him more crystals, then he'll stock just a larger number of potions, as well as giving you a free one every time you return to the hub. And there are more like this as well, with quite a few NPCs and other things that you can interact with, giving them increasing amounts of crystals for various buffs and enhanced effects, including a bonfire that will give you a long-lasting health increase that goes up to 80%, which is pretty huge, or a statue that you can sacrifice increasing amounts of crystals to permanently upgrade your maximum health. And of course there are also the doors to each of the new dungeon areas, which take crystals to unlock for the first time as well. The interesting thing about this game's RPG mechanics is that there are no levels. There's no experience or leveling up or putting points into stats or anything like that. Instead, how strong you are is determined entirely by what you're equipped with. And because of this, there are a whole bunch of different equipment slots that you can slot items into, from your various armor slots, a weapon, an offhand slot, and various like rune and sort of miscellaneous slots. So there's a lot here to make a build off of. This also means that your build is very flexible, because you don't have to respec points or anything to change what you're doing. You just equip new stuff. So the itemization in this game is really good because it's the main way that you're actually getting stronger. There are several different rarities of items, up to and including legendary, unique, and eventually heroic, although that's like post-game sort of a purple rarity that you'll only see much later on, but all the other rarities are things that you can find pretty much all the time. And there are a lot of different sort of affixes or enchantments, different effects that equipment can have. And the developer has really gone out of their way to make it so getting loot is exciting. Basically, because it's one of the main things you're going to be doing, they wanted it to be enjoyable, and it definitely is, because there's a lot of different effects. So you're very rarely going to get something that just gives you like a tiny crit chance increase or a little bit of extra maximum health. Most of the time, the effects that loot gives you are really noticeable and significant. And your build is going to be composed of all of the pieces of loot that you have and how they all work together. Since you have these 12 equipment slots, that's quite a lot of space to change stuff, or space to create a sort of synergistic build, because the idea behind this game is you want to get overpowered. You want to get as strong as possible, because it does get quite difficult later on. So the whole point is to create a build of items that all work together, they synergize in some way to become better than they would be separately and make you ridiculously strong. You may start off with just a simple shield and pokey stick combo, but eventually you end up with like a huge greatsword that sends out 12 explosive slashes that'll have a super high crit chance and make you dash around the battlefield every time you swing it. And all of this is possible just because of the combination of loot that you happen to have at the time. Also, every single piece of loot can be upgraded. You have these things called embers, which are like upgrade stones that you can find, and you'll find higher tier ones as you go through the game. You can also combine them together, and 5 of a previous tier will create 1 of the next tier up. And each one will increase the tier of an item by 1, so a tier 2 ember will increase it straight to a +2 item. You don't have to use them in order if you don't want to. You can use the highest one possible and it will skip all the way to that tier. And every item can be improved in this way because basically whatever numbers it has on it, whatever it says it does, it'll just do better. So that's what upgrades do. That makes them really important. They just increase whatever an item does and simply make it stronger across the board. So you want to have as many upgraded items as possible. Another really cool feature that it actually took me a minute to realize I could do because I didn't see the NPC at first is you can actually meld items together, and it will combine whatever it is they do and make one item that does both things. And if the items have the same stat as well as new things, then it will average it out. So if you combine a weapon that freezes people and a weapon that drops meteors on people, then you'll get a weapon that both freezes and drops meteors on people, and it will average out the damage of both of those and give you the sort of mean result of that. So all this is to say you can get extremely powerful feeling in this game pretty quickly because you have so many slots to put stuff into and so many rarities of interesting things to find. It's pretty easy to come across a build that makes you feel strong, but this doesn't make the game easy because as you get into the later areas, the enemies get really threatening and have all sorts of range attacks and some other really nasty stuff you've got to deal with, like the ability to actually throw you around the level and smack you against walls and stuff like that. So you've got to be pretty careful. You can die pretty easily in this game, even if you have a lot of armor and stuff, just because the later areas have very strong enemies in them. If you're wondering about that other sort of greenish gauge at the bottom of the screen there, that's called power, and that is just a sort of an extra weapon attack. Every weapon in this game has some sort of power attack, and you gain power just by dealing damage and performing multiple quick hits and stuff like that. And once it is up to a certain threshold determined by whatever weapon you're using, each one costs a different amount, you can hit the Q key to do a power attack. And some of these are just like extra powerful swings, and some of them are much more advanced things like firing out multiple waves of moonlight energy that can ignore enemies' defenses and things. I really like how each of the dungeon areas is not only unique in terms of how it looks and the enemies that populate it, but also in terms of the mechanics. I like the fact that each dungeon has its own mechanics, like the aforementioned curse dungeon that has you collecting curses to spend on stuff or to just make yourself stronger with. The boss fights are also pretty cool because they're very difficult and they usually have several different attacks and often multiple phases to learn, which I'm always a fan of. The midpoint bosses of each dungeon are not as difficult as you would expect, but they're still pretty tricky, and they also have an entire level that you have to complete after them. So the boss isn't it. You still have several chambers worth of dungeon to go through before you're actually done, whereas the final boss of each area is much harder, has a lot more mechanics to it, usually oftentimes multiple waves of ads that it spawns, and it's also the only thing you'll face. Once you beat it, then you're done. You don't have to go through the rest of the level. Overall, I'd say that for the level of polish and content that's here, the price is definitely right. It's a really enjoyable action RPG with some really good atomization. I would say that a lot of games in this genre could actually take some cues from this game in terms of how to make loot interesting, because there's pretty much no boring piece of loot in the game. Every weapon has its own power attack. Some of them have some really neat effects. Even small passive stuff often has some really useful effects, and the fact that they can be melded with each other to create more powerful items that only take up a single slot means that you're always looking out for new stuff, and getting loot is always exciting. It's actually pretty easy to forget that this is an early access game just because pretty much the entire game is already here. There's also been a lot of updates recently, and the game gets very frequent updates, some of which are pretty large. Others are very balance heavy, changing things around, so I have no difficulties recommending this game to any action RPG enjoyer. It's got some really fun items and stuff to find, and of course some lovely spooky themed pixel art as well, and the music is quite good. I haven't really talked about that, but yeah, the music fits the kind of spooky, crunchy style of everything. So yeah, for its price, I highly recommend it, and I think that it's an easy sell with the amount of content and polish it currently has. I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Into the Necrovale if you guys wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.